Okay, thank you for tuning in. My name is Syntact. This is going to be kind of my first proper tutorial type thing. I want to get into pretty much all the sound design that I did for this Scatta remake. I figure most of you are probably here for the growl, so I'll get into that in just a second. But before then, I want to address two important things. First one is, if you're not part of the Skrillex remake community, then you probably don't know about this spreadsheet. What this is basically a list of every single publicly available sample that Skrillex has ever used. And so it's really quite extensive, but I thought I should start here because this is sort of where I started for a lot of these things. Everything here I used. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is because I was looking through these sample packs that are listed, and I actually found a few more that I thought were totally part of the original song. I want to show this to you first. I'm going to list them in terms of my confidence that they were actually part of the original song. The first one is this, which is sort of a crowd effect sample that comes in halfway through the drop. It sounds like this. I was looking through Vengeance Vocal Essentials Volume 1, and I found these two samples. It's not perfect, but I'm fairly certain that they were at least part of that. Next is part of the snare, not all of it. This is the original snare from the song. Now, I found this snare, which seemed to match in terms of phase and all that. On its own, it doesn't really sound too similar, but if I go like this and only play this section. Next is this riser. It's not loud at all, but this is the one that I found. It's pitched down here so that it kind of stays at a more consistent pitch. And then halfway through, right here, it goes to its original pitch, which is an actual rising riser. So that's that. Next, I have a few effects samples that I believe were used in the build. In the build, we have some growls, and underneath the growls, there's layered sort of a monster breath type sample, and then also a few different effects, hits, etc. So those are just some samples that I really want added to this spreadsheet here. So yeah, if anyone knows the people who are running this, I would really love to know them and submit these. If there's anyone who can confirm it better than I can with phase or whatever. The second thing I wanted to address is that this project file is actually for sale on my Patreon if you'd like to skip this entire tutorial thing. But in that project file, I forgot to include two patches that I resampled, put in this project file, and forgot to upload. There's this one, which is from the build. It's this wind chime here. I forgot it, and there's also this one. It's a very small part of the second half of drop 2, but those two I just forgot to include. So in the second link in the description, I will include a download. This came from the Ableton Live 8 factory library, and it's a real finicky patch because it has a whole bunch of LFOs. You have to get exactly right in the resampling in order to make it sound like the original song, but that will be in the description for free as a download. And anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into the growl. So I'm going to show you the verse growl, the drop growl, then the build growl, and the reason behind that is for a long time, I always thought this sounds exactly like a massive bass. And for whatever reason, I was operating under the assumption that the growl in the verses, the drop, and the build were all the same massive patch, just with different levels of external processing. So by the end of making this, I actually ended up not so sure about that assumption, but nevertheless, that is how I made these growls in this one. So it'll be simplest for me to start with growl in the verse and then work our way up. This is the growl in the verse. For the massive patch, we have two oscillators, one squelchy and one chrome. The modulation oscillator is on with a tiny amount of ring mod and a tiny bit more of phase mod, and both are affecting oscillator 1. I also have a tiny bit of tape noise just to add a little bit of artifacting. The filter is just going directly into one band reject filter. For the inserts, just one parabolic shaper, and for the effects, one dimension expander. These 5 parameters are being modulated by this slow LFO, triangle wave, synced 1 bar length. The last important thing is in the oscillator tab, enable restart via gate, and adjust the phase of the modulation oscillator to about 300 degrees. So that's it for the massive patch. These 3 OTTs are on, but I also have this corpus patch. Basically, this is a preset that exists in the current Ableton Factory library and the Live 8 Factory library. And this preset, I 100% believe this was an essential part of the original Skrillex growl. It's just the tubular pan preset, but modified just a tiny bit. The LFO has been disabled and the filter has been enabled. And this filter is being automated like this, just going back and forth between these two automations. Then at the end, we just have some EQ, some soft clipping, and low pass filter to reduce the harshness. And that's the finished product. Okay, for the drop growl, we have almost the same massive patch. The second oscillator has actually been disabled. The filter has slightly different settings. Dimension expander has been disabled. Parabolic shaper, I think, looks a little bit different. And yeah, that's pretty much it. For the wave shaping phase, I actually put this EQ on it. And then I've done the wave shaping with this overdrive and this amp. There's also a gate in here, but it's like not doing much. It's just getting rid of whatever tails are there for the OTT. For the corpus, same deal, except this filter, instead of being directly automated, is mapped to this macro. This macro does most of the modulation. You can see the shapes I've drawn here. And there is another one. I'll get into that once we reach that part of the chain, but this one holds the majority of the mappings. I'll show you exactly which parameters are mapped to it and how exactly their mappings work once we reach the end of the chain. But yes, this sort of band passy filter is mapped to this macro. So far, sounds like that. I also have, for whatever reason, this is the old version of the high pass filter and the even older version of the low pass filter. I basically did that for some artifacts from the super old auto filter, but not too many. So the slightly newer auto filter is doing the high passing. But yeah, the settings look like this. 0 resonance on the low pass, frequency maps to the growl macro, and a high amount of resonance, 12 decibel, and this one's frequency also maps to the growl macro. A little bit of EQ to balance out the low mids. Then we have this static phaser. This is where a lot of the resonance comes from. And I also have the phaser's frequency mapped to this second macro. And this is the only thing it's mapped to, but it's being modulated in a very different way. For this growl, you have to modulate things very sparingly in order for it to not sound like a Space Laces bass, basically. The last movement effect is this chorus, and I also believe that this was a pretty integral part of the original growl. It's basically just the original patch with these two settings on the rate and the amount, dry wet 37%. Then, of course, the OTTs, and in between the second and third OTT here, I have one dimension expander, these settings, and a gate just to minimize the tails. Some EQ to make room for the sub, a little bit more shaping EQ, and soft clipping. And then, of course, the whole thing is grouped together with a sub, which has its volume mapped in reverse to the growl macro. Now, I have to move myself so you guys can see this. Hopefully that worked. These are the mappings. If you want to take a quick screenshot, basically, growl macro has these 4 things: the filter on the corpus, the first auto filter, which is the low pass, the second auto filter, which is doing the majority of the movement, and the sub bass, which is mapped in reverse. And then there's, of course, the phaser center frequency, which is mapped to a separate macro. That's what it sounds like pre-resampling, but I did resample every one, and they're not being really warped or anything, but they do have a few effects. I first have another legacy auto filter, but it's quite subtle. You can't really hear what it's doing until this one. The maximum it goes up to is 3K, and you can't really hear what it's doing until here. Yeah, so I have another low pass, soften up the highs. I have this multiband dynamics, which is basically just acting as a limiter for the sub. This reverb patch, which I thought was necessary. It sort of fills out the ambience of the bass a little bit. One last OTT, 43%. A little bit of high passing and a bit more high passing on the sideband with mid-side EQ, and then more soft clipping, which is pretty much always what I finish my bass chains with. And so the resamples end up accurate enough, I think. Here we have the growl in the build. It is the exact same patch from the drop. The articulation looks a little bit different, so the automation looks like this. Yeah, that's basically it, and it's been resampled to this channel. There's some more effects on it, but first it goes through a chorus, and then it's being bussed alongside that Monster Breath sample that I mentioned earlier, and the chain looks like this. One OTT, one reverb. The lows are being boosted here to go into the soft clipper and then reduced back down. So that is what the reverb is doing. And once again, there's this sort of Monster Breath sample. The Monster Breath sample, which is also going into the OTT and the reverb and all of that, it has these effects, and once they're bussed together, I think they gel together pretty well. Just as a sort of side point, this track is really interesting, especially in this build, because what you're hearing Skrillex do is he has the growl that's like echoing out with this big reverb and building up this ambience, which goes into this gigantic build. And he's layered the growl with all of these different effects. Like there's a vocal thing in there, but there's also these effects samples that sort of call and response in between the monster growl and the monster breath and whatever. And it's very interesting because I don't think we've ever heard him use these techniques, which are very advanced. Like this is stuff I learned in like post audio production school, this exact technique of layering. And each of these effects occupy kind of their own frequency band and stereo placement, and like all together, like I'll play each of them one by one so that you can hear what's going on. This is the resampled growl. Then we have the monster breath. And there's also this. Then there's also this cool thing. And then there's the wind chime patch that I mentioned. So I thought that was all pretty interesting, and most of it is Vengeance samples, but the way that it's all arranged is really cool, and this is how I did it in mine. So that's pretty much it for the build. Now, for the rest of the drop, I want to do kind of a speed round. I'm going to go through each of these really fast because they're not quite as complicated as the growls were. So first of all, we have this. The patch looks like this. It's 2 oscillators, 1 millifant, 1 mellomatic. So that's what it sounds like before the scream filter, which is being modulated ever so slightly. The filter routings are actually pretty important in this one. The filters are in parallel, and first oscillator is going mostly to the scream filter. This one is going mostly to the none filter with left beef, and the mix looks like this, mostly biased towards the none filter. The purpose of this is basically so that like you have the basic screaminess, but there's also like this mid layer. And together, they sound quite a bit beefier than just like the screamy part. I also have a fair amount of teletube that also shapes the sound pretty heavily. This dimension expander for some width. These parameters are all being modulated by this performer, 3:16 ratio, and this shape. For the external processing, I have this legacy chorus, 2 OTTs, high-pass filter to remove the sub, played in parallel with an independent sub, then they're bussed together with a bit of EQ, soft clipping. Next up is the second screamer wobble type thing. So this one is pretty similar to the first. It's just 1 oscillator, mellifant, bend minus plus. These settings, scream filter being modulated more heavily than the first. Performer looks pretty much the same. Teletube again, dimension expander again. External processing looks pretty much the same. Tiny bit of basically insignificant EQ. 2 OTTs, high pass, low pass to soften the highs, in parallel with another sub, and then soft clipping again. Next up, we have this Reese thing. Now, this one was actually really fun to make. The patch is pretty simple, but it sounds a little bit complicated, but I find it really cool because it has kind of like these 2 competing tones that sort of compete together and then are fed into like some saturation, and that gives it sort of this beating effect, and then it also has some really cool filter movement. So it's just 1 saw wave, 5 voices, pitch cutoff is enabled and looks like this, pan position is not on, don't worry about that, but the main modulator here is envelope 1, and that is being sent to the pitch cutoff slightly. We also have two filters in series. The first one is this comb filter, and then it's going through this high pass. And that just gives it a tiny bit of like filter movement, which is important for a Reese. Now, this envelope is like doing some weird shit, and it's confusing even to me, like 10 days after I finished this project file. But basically, just you're gonna have to just copy these settings as best you can. What I really needed when I made it was a tiny bit of attack, a little bit of decay, and then I needed it to go back up again. So this is how I got there, and this is how it's like being modulated. There's also a tiny bit of chorus, just copy these settings. For the external processing, I have dimension expander for some width, this saturator, which is very important. That's before and after. That's important for any Reese type sound. Then one OTT, basic settings, and volume boosted, and into this soft clipper. And that's what it sounds like before this EQ, which is pretty important. It's just softening the highs and the lows into the low mids so that it's not so harsh. And that's the finished product. Pretty cool Reese. Next is this one. It is pretty similar to the most recent Reese, motherfucker. Again, it's just one normal saw wave, 9 voices. Pitch cutoff looks the same as the last one. In mono again, the filters are in series. The first one is this bandpass with envelope 1 sent to these settings, and then it goes through this comb filter for some overtones. And then the envelope looks like this. That's pretty much it. For the external processing, I have this chorus with these settings, another saturator, very similar to the last one, 3 OTTs, regular settings, and once again, the soft clipping and some EQ just to soften up the highs and get rid of the lows that the soft clipper introduced. And that's that synth. So I want to quickly go over this bass. These are all samples from a sample pack. Originally, it sounds like this. I'll turn the effects off just so you can hear it. And it's from a sample pack whose name I will remember during editing, and I felt like these settings felt the most true to that era of Skrillex music. This is the dimension expander, then it's going through this OTT, soft clipping, and EQ again. And that's it. Okay, next up is the glitches. I'm not gonna get into like every single one. They sound really weird and complicated, but in reality they're not. What I learned while doing this remake is that all of these glitches were made the same way, and the way that he did them is by resampling the rest of the drop and then using the textures warp mode to like mess around with them. And I'll show you one example. I won't get into all of them, but we have... It sounds very complicated and weird. It doesn't use beat repeat, it doesn't use D-Blue or any other glitch plugin. It's only using the warp modes. So this, it started out as this one, but it was really shortened. Warp is turned on once it's been shortened. Grain size 205, flux 0. Still the same. Pitch is increased 19 semitones. So pitched up, it's like this. And then it gets stretched out to like 8 times its length. And yeah, that's what gives it like that sort of beat repeat sort of texture. Okay, next we have this pluck thing. This is like the first synth you hear in the whole song. I kind of always thought that this sounded a lot like the DigiGrain wavetable, and so that's what I'm using. It's set to bend minus plus mode, going into one low pass filter. Modulation oscillator is on with phase modulation on oscillator 1 with a dimension expander enabled. Unison is set to 3 voices with a moderate amount of pan position. Now we have this here envelope that's controlling the amplitude, and the level is set to 0 as this much decay, but we also have this envelope which is routed to the filter cutoff and the wavetable position. I also have a dimension expander enabled, but the most important part of this patch is the velocity mapping. I have the velocity here mapped to the oscillator amplitude and the filter cutoff. The reason for that is I have this sort of one note arpeggiation type thing, and the velocities on these notes are sort of being stepped. So that's what that's doing. The only other thing here is this MIDI effect here. The purpose of this is pretty simple. It's when I play this E2 note, this chord device is also going to make it play the fifth and the minor third. So for external processing, it's going through a bit of saturation, some compression, some EQ. This rack is just like a low pass that gets automated once the vocals come in. So that's pretty much it. That's the meat and potatoes of my remake of this song. I hope you learned something, and if you made it this far through my rambling, thank you. If there was anything that you feel I left out, I should also mention that I have sort of a companion tutorial on my Patreon where I'm covering pretty much everything that I left out of this video, all the glitches, how I put together the snare, how I process the drums and all that, and all the mixing and mastering techniques that are very complicated and very proprietary, so I'm not just like gonna give that away. If you felt like you learned something and you feel like supporting this project, then I would really appreciate it. Also, if you would like this project file, it is once again available for sale on my Patreon. So that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching.